We can talk about this Candace Owens tweet because it really is baffling to me. Let me read this to you guys. This is from yesterday. This was right after April 1st, so this is not an April Fool's prank. This is from Candace Owens, who's been in a spite recently with the Daily Wire and Ben Shapiro, as she has been let go from the company and has been making her run as an independent content creator without any brands again. I saw her on Destiny Show and other places as well. She tweeted out on yesterday, April 2nd, 2024, President Zelensky, in reference to the president of Ukraine, sure is behaving like a Bolshevist. How many more Christians will he conscript to death? So there's a bunch of ways that I can go at this. And so I think I'm just going to go at this from part 1 and part 2 of this tweet. So the first sentence and the second sentence. So the first sentence is, President Zelensky sure is behaving like a Bolshevist. Now, if you know anything about Zelensky's politics, or where he's from, his economic worldview, you would know that he is anything but a Bolshevist. He is a television star. He is from, you know, the Ukrainian media elite, if you would call it that. He is somebody economically who's of the opinion that the government needs to let go of the economic controls in the country, that the government, through its corruption and kleptocratic control and Soviet style of doing things, the quote-unquote Soviet mentality that is frequently referenced in Ukrainian politics and Ukrainian social life, is a weight on the country that needs to be removed, that the shackles on industry need to be removed. I remember at one point there was even a question, and this is a very much this is something you would expect from a Republican in the United States. For every one regulation that is put in place, the Zelensky rule was that you needed to remove 2, if I remember correctly. Now, I'm trying to remember back to like the campaign. When I was doing research on him and his campaign and stuff like that. But to be clear, before I get into any more specifics, economically, he's anything but a communist, a socialist. In fact, many of the trade unions are unhappy with Zelensky due to certain actions the government is taking during wartime to give workers in some industries, like trade unions, less protections in order to try to free up labor for the war economy. There's other things as well, but the point is, economically, he's not a Bolshevist. Now, if you go look at Zelensky's family history, he's not really a Bolshevist either. It's not like he comes from this strong party lineage. He hasn't like engaged in Russophilia or, you know, big praise of the Bolsheviks or the communists or any of that sort of stuff. The only stuff that I could even think of is that during one of the holidays that celebrates the victory in World War II, Zelensky praised Ukrainian soldiers that fought in the Soviet Red Army against the Nazi regime. He praised them. That is but that's a viewpoint held by all Ukrainians, that yes, it's good that they beat the Nazis. That's not necessarily a Bolshevist viewpoint. So there's no way you could really call Zelensky, from his politics or from what he believes, a Bolshevist. But she says he's behaving like a Bolshevist. Well, what does that mean? How is he behaving like a Bolshevist? And that's how you get to the second part of this. And that is, by the way, I'll get into the anti-Semitism angle in a second. I just don't want to lead with that because there's wiggle room that I want to discuss. So that's how we get into the second angle here. How is he behaving like a Bolshevist? How many more Christians will he conscript to death? So if you can't find anywhere economically or anywhere else that Zelensky is showing Bolshevik values, then it must be in the second part of this tweet. It must be what else she's referencing here. It must be the fact that Zelensky's government, and this is what she must be commenting on because it's the only thing I could imagine she's commenting on, is that Zelensky recently lowered the recruitment threshold from 72 years of age to 25. Now, that might be confusing because in the West and in most countries, that's not how it's done. It's usually young people first, then the older people. But in Ukraine, much like in Russia, they have a certain demographic problem. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, due to the Soviet mismanagement, a bunch of different things, but the Soviet Union collapsed and demographics collapsed with it. Nobody felt like having kids in the ruins of the Soviet Union with the street kid crisis, the poverty crisis, prices. I mean, Deutsche Bank predicted before the Soviet collapse that Ukraine would be one of the most prosperous Soviet economies going into the future, and then it broke the record for inflation. I think it was 10,400%. So horrible, horrible, horrible inflation rates. And so both in Russia and in Ukraine, there was a big dip off in births. And that's never truly recovered. And for this reason, Ukraine has a lot less young people than it has old people. Its demographic tree is not the healthiest. And for that reason, both Ukraine and Russia and other countries with this dilemma have a national priority in trying to preserve that young base so they can produce, income, GDP, monetary value that can support the elderly people that are more often than not now entering retirement. So that's why you have a lot more people in the Ukrainian military who's recruited at an older age, late 20s, 30s, and low 40s, sometimes even going into the 50s. And that's also something that's true in the Russian army as well. Now, this practice of prioritizing this age group is not, I think, exactly what she's talking about here. I don't think it's that he moved the age bracket from 27 to 25 to get 26 and 27-year-olds conscripted. I don't really think that's specifically what she's talking about. So I would have to assume that she's just talking about the idea of conscripting people in general who happen to be Christians. This seems to be centered on the idea that it's Christians being conscripted and dying. Maybe the Chechen fighters that they have could be ignored. Maybe the others who are not Christians and have come from other backgrounds, maybe Crimean Tatar Muslims, they would be allowed to be conscripted. The other people who have of diverse backgrounds, I guess those people are not of the priority here. The priority is Jesus's children. It's the Orthodox Christians of Ukraine. I don't know if she cares about the Protestant Christians and how they've been treated. That's a whole other story, how Protestant Christians have been treated in occupied territory and Catholic Christians. But she cares about the Christians. If this is the case, if this is what Bolshevik behavior is, then we would ultimately have to come to the conclusion that FDR was a Bolshevik. Franklin Delano Roosevelt must have been a Bolshevik because he conscripted Christians to fight, in many instances, other Christians as well in Europe. I guess Winston Churchill must have also been a Bolshevik because he conscripted Christians and they fought a war as well. General de Gaulle must have been a Bolshevik, Bolshevist. I don't know why we're going Bolshevik and not Bolshevik, but I guess we're going with Bolshevist. I guess he would have been a Bolshevist. I guess all of Europe that fought the Nazis, that have majority Christian populations, would be Bolshevist. The Danish were Bolshevist for this little bit of period they resisted. The Norwegians were Bolshevist. The Dutch were Bolshevist. The Belgians were Bolshevist. It seems just about everyone who engages in the act of conscription while having Christians, don't know why that is the important part here, is Bolshevist. This is silly. Doesn't make any sense. Recruiting and conscripting Christians does not make you Bolshevist. If that's the case, then the Russians are Bolshevists too, because they're also conscripting Christians. And so then what would this make this? An inter-Bolshevist war? This would mean that the Polish, when they were fighting the invading Bolshevik army during the Polish-Soviet War of the 1920s, it would be an inter-communist struggle. Bolshevist against Bolshevist. I'm sorry, I can't keep saying Bolshevik against Bolshevik. I don't like saying Bolshevist. It just sounds stupid. Bolshevik. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense if you know any history of the region, any of the history around communism, etc. If that's the case, then the Tsar of Russia, who the Soviets rose up against, was a Bolshevik. I'm sorry that we never gave the proper respect to the true Bolshevik icon, the Russian Tsar, and his father before him, and his father before him. This completely degrades any of the word and meaning of Bolshevik. This completely degrades what Bolsheviks were during the Russian Revolution, what they believed in, their hardline stance, the stance of people like Lenin, the stance of people like Trotsky, the stance of people like Stalin, and degrades it into nothing more than a conscription policy. Now, I said a few things about this because this tweet makes no sense to me. The first is that just Candace Owens is politically illiterate and she wants to find a way to attack her opponents. And in American political culture, if somebody's slightly left of center, and I guess Zelensky is to the left of Candace Owens on social issues, I would guess, you know, which is, you know, I get, I don't know. She's just calling him a communist because that's the way of doing things. If you're left of Rush Limbaugh, you're a commie, you know? Maybe that's the angle. There's another angle here where it's just that, and I don't want to say this, but I gotta be blunt, is that Zelensky's Jewish. Zelensky's Jewish, and there's a long-going stereotype where the Bolsheviks were all led by the Jews, and the Jews led the Bolshevik Revolution, and that it was a Jewish plot. And maybe this is an attempt to try to connect Zelensky's Jewishness as like an attack on Christians, because there was a big, during the Second World War and the lead up to the Second World War, there was a lot of propaganda about the idea that communism and Bolshevism was a Jewish plot to attack Christians, to attack white people, to attack Europe. And the idea of a Jew recruiting Christians to send them to their death, and that's acting like Bolsheviks, you know, it does seem to click those boxes. Now, of course, I cannot read the intent of Candace Owens, and so I've narrowed it down to either one, she's politically illiterate, two, she's anti-Semitic, or likely three, both. But I can't read her intentions. I know that she's, you know, boosted tweets that have called about, you know, talked about Jews drinking the blood of Christians. So, you know, it's that pattern of behavior that makes me think, well, I at the very least have to consider it. Either way, though, this is politically illiterate, even if it is or isn't connected to any anti-Semitism. Either way, this argument or this tweet doesn't stand up on its own merits. She's either brain dead, anti-Semitic, or both. Because if you're anti-Semitic, you're brain dead anyway.